Hi, everyone. Can you hear me OK? Yep, great. So my name is Anastasia Leng. I'm the founder and CEO of Picasso Labs. And I want to start by telling you a story. So in 2013, I left my very comfortable job at Google to start my own company. And fast forward 2 years later, after putting all my social and financial capital into this new venture, the company is failing. Now, I'm too embarrassed to admit that something I've sank everything into after leaving this very, very comfy corporate environment is not working. And so at this point, the company was an e-commerce company. I bury myself into a corner, look over every single thing I possibly can to figure out how do I get this bloody thing to work. And what I start noticing is that essentially we can't compete in traditional advertising methods. We don't have enough money to compete on Google search. The cost is too high, where traditional advertising means television, print, even display are simply not accessible to a small startup like ours. But then I start noticing that actually the bulk of our conversions and the bulk of our traffic is coming from visual networks, Instagram, Pinterest, running an image on Facebook. But when I look at those images, it's not immediately clear why one image is doing really well in terms of cutting through with a potential customer and another one is not. And because we have no money but a lot of time and a lot of engineers on our hands, we start building image recognition technology. Technology that goes very deep inside an image, automatically figures out everything that's contained in that image, and then is able to calculate how a consumer's reaction to that image is changing based on what's inside. And when we start to do this, we start to see some real patterns for our own imagery. That images with models of a certain hair color, for some reason for our audience, are getting more clicks. The way we photograph things are making a big difference to performance. And so we go out there and we start fundraising. And with $30,000 left in our bank account for a team of 8 very expensive engineers, a number of investors decide to dig under the hood and ask us how we're doing what we're doing, how we're growing revenue, and essentially pull us aside and say, hey, look, we'll give you money, but only if you start a second company. And so Picasso Labs, out of pure serendipity and sheer unwillingness to admit that I had failed, is born. And here we got incredibly lucky. But really, underneath all that luck, there were a number of things brewing in the background that made data-driven creative something that was timely last summer. And there are a couple of things that really led to this. So one is what we all know, right? The world is visual, increasingly more so. Consumers are spending all of their time on platforms where they're communicating through imagery and video. The joke about my generation and our generation for a lot of folks in this room is that we can't read, which is ultimately quite offensive, but this is what the older generations tend to think of us. In addition to this, 1 trillion photos are taken in 2015, including a lot of photos of brands that are being generated without any input. At the same time, marketers are realizing, and 65% of them agree, which is a big shift from the year before, that visual is core to how their brand is being communicated. But what they don't know is what their images are saying. What they don't know is why a certain image is cutting through and others are falling by the wayside. But the thing that gets all of it to crest is that in 2016, this was the first year that display advertising has overtaken search. And at the same time, the cherry on the cake is that the very summer that my first company is failing and we're experimenting with anything we can to try and get our revenue up, Pinterest, Instagram, and Snapchat launched their advertising platforms, opening up a brand new medium of engagement with its consumers. And what marketers realize at that point is that all the technology we've had to date, the technology that tells us where we should run an ad, at what time, who we should show it to, which keywords we should use, are completely useless when it comes to display. Because when it comes to display, the image is king, and yet we have no data. It is predominantly an art with very little science. Now, in this case, what we're seeing is really a kind of a merger of technology and psychology. So all of the technology is bringing us to this visual medium. But what makes this even more powerful is that we process visual information very differently than search, or text, rather. We process visual information 60,000 times faster. And the result of this quick appraisal is that we can walk away with a very emotional feeling after seeing an image or a video, a feeling that will stay with us in a way that text usually cannot do. But this is not all good news. As display is proliferating through the digital space, What's happening is that consumers are becoming completely immune to traditional advertising. And this one-size-fits-most messaging is simply not working. And what this means for media and advertising companies is that they're leaving traditional cable, they're going to subscriptions, they're opting in for ad-free formats. But the thing that really brings this to life is ad blocking. Ad blocking has grown tremendously in the past 5 years. And by 2017, a quarter of the UK population will be using ad blocking. And so as a result of this, it's gotten harder and harder to communicate. And so what's happening is for a media company, essentially what this means is you need a different way of making money. That's one, but that's all something we all know. But secondly, and more importantly, that the big behemoths, the Goliaths who communicated because they had the largest budgets, are no longer able to play by the same game. So in this world where digital and visual is starting to take over and ad blocking is coming from behind, what's happening is that new winners and losers are being defined. And what's happening is that the winners who are breaking through are digital savvy, image and video-led companies, because they're not playing the same game. In media, what we're seeing is that companies that started later, that are breaking through, have a very different approach. Companies like Netflix and Vice, companies like Upworthy, BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, you're seeing this a lot in CPG and fashion, these upstarts coming from nowhere and overtaking the behemoths from a market share perspective, but also doing it significantly more effectively by spending a lot less money. And when you look at them, the question is, well, what do they all have in common? And what they have in common is that data is their competitive advantage. Now, this isn't just about collecting data or analyzing data or grabbing big data from everywhere you can. This is actually a lot more subtle than that. So what they're doing is they are fundamentally changing the culture within the company to be a data-informed culture. They are pushing the most senior leaders within their company to make decisions as a result of data and not intuition. They're taking every function within the company, functions that were predominantly art, and asking them to become a little bit more science. And this is a very powerful shift that many industries and many companies have been afraid of. But the upstarts that are rising up are really creating this data-informed culture. And the reality is that marketers, this is the hardest time to be a marketer. Marketers have never had to be more data-driven to succeed. But the one part of the marketing process that still remains pretty devoid of data is the creative. We do not do enough to ask ourselves, why is this creative cutting through? Yes, it's a beautiful piece of art, but why did this resonate? And why don't we do this? Why don't we ask ourselves the question? Why don't we try and find out what is it about this creative that's really resonating, and not from a panel of 10 people where we then extrapolate to thousands? Why don't we really use this data to find out? And the question is, it's because it's hard. And my argument is that up until about a year or two ago, it was actually impossible. So when we look at an image like this, and we walk away with a subjective appraisal of an image. We'll say, this is a good image or a bad image, I like this image or I don't like this image. I'm sure you've all sat in a creative review meeting where the most senior person in the room says, well, I just don't like it, and the conversation is more or less over. Technology, and our technology, looks at an image a little bit differently. We look at an image like this. So in real time, automatically, we codify every single thing that's contained within that image. And what we then do with this essentially giant set of metadata is we combine it with real-time performance information about how your users are reacting to your imagery on any platform, any channel in real time. And what that gives us is the ability to pinpoint how does the presence or absence of certain factors impact users' ability to like, click, convert, purchase, subscribe, even pick up a magazine from newsstands as a result of what they see in the image. Really starting to answer the why behind creative performance. Now, this is nothing new. I was a psychology major at university, and the idea that we can influence consumer behavior through visual stimuli is something psychologists have been doing for years. For example, a couple of years ago in Japan, there was a case where people kept going to this one train station to commit suicide. And in order to try and solve this problem, the government decided to install blue lighting, because blue lighting has a calming effect. They've actually done the same thing in Glasgow about 12 years ago on one of the main streets where they had a lot of crime and saw a 9% reduction in crime. This is also why in some of the rougher parts of London, you'll hear classical music being played into tube as you go up and down. It's the same exact logic. Pharmaceutical companies have been accused of using color theory to influence the results of their studies, essentially heightening the placebo effect. Red pills are thought to be more uppers, blue pills are meant to be downers, and they're using these colors to actually influence how they think consumers will rate the effectiveness of the pill. And a little fun fact for you, one of the biggest criticisms about Viagra is that it's blue. Because people don't expect a pill that has the impact of Viagra to be blue. And actually, some people report taking it by accident when they're reaching for something else, thinking it's going to be a downer pill, and end up with a nice Viagra surprise. Now, brands know this, right? Most brands understand that color and imagery and visual make a difference to performance. And they do this in small, subtle ways. Color and around logos and things like that make a big difference. If you open your phone right now and look at every food app or every app where you tend to sort of waste time, you'll notice that it's probably red or orange. That's not an accident. That's your designer knowing that anytime we are trying to encourage impulsive behavior, those are the colors we want to use. When you look at companies that ask you to give away your financial information, your banking information, your user data, such as Facebook, they're blue. That's not an accident. Blue is trustworthy. Blue is safe. When we saw this chart, we started to notice that if you wanted global domination, it seemed like rainbow was the color to go for, but I'm not sure if that's statistically significant. This also goes to font. So I don't know how many people have heard about the Baskerville study. This was done on the New York Times webpage a couple of years ago. They asked 45,000 users to read a passage provided by a New York Times writer, and say how much they trusted or agreed with what the writer was saying. And the only thing they varied was font. And what they essentially found was there were certain fonts that were perceived to be more trustworthy, more agreeable to what the passage was saying. And the most trustworthy font is Baskerville. The least trustworthy font was Helvetica and Comic Sans. Again, statistically significant data. So what's happening here is that a data revolution is taking place in these very unexpected industries, places that, again, have been predominantly dominated by art. I'm sure you guys have all read or seen Moneyball, right? So Moneyball is a great example of scouts using information about how baseball players actually play on the field and finding that that does not predict how successful they'll be when they get to the major leagues. And someone having the audacity to challenge this expert mentality, to challenge this opinion-based, I am the dominant expert and what I say goes, and no one can argue with that. And find that actually that if they start to take the physical aspect away, the way a player pitches, the way they act on the field, there are other factors that are significantly more predictive about how they'll perform when they get to the pros. Netflix. Netflix is a company I love because they've really pushed the envelope when it comes to data. And what they're doing is, in my view, data-driven programming. So House of Cards is an interesting example. I'm sure many of you guys have heard the analogy behind House of Cards. But what Netflix has done with House of Cards is they used user data, and they have a treasure trove of user data, to create what they viewed was essentially a show that was going to be commercially successful. They used data around how well people rated the British version of House of Cards. They looked at, to cast Kevin Spacey, they looked at actor data, looking at which actors were most likely to be highly rated in movies, where users were pausing in what scenes they were watching over and over again to create House of Cards. Now, House of Cards went on to be a critical success, of course, but you can argue that, they had a pretty good precedent, right? They had the British version of House of Cards. Orange is the New Black is a much harder case to make. And actually, there was really nothing, intuitively speaking, that told you that a show about women in prison was going to be a critical success. But yet, Netflix had the data. And what Netflix had seen from analyzing its treasure trove of user data was that dark comedy was on the rise. People were watching more and more dark comedy and rating it highly. Shows with a strong female lead that showed some degree of vulnerability was also ranked highly. And most importantly, prison shows did well. They did well with a niche audience, but they did do well. And when they looked at those data sets together, they found that there was actually kind of a healthy Venn diagram in terms of how different users engage with that type of content. Creating Orange is the New Black. Many people told Netflix the show was going to fail, that no one wanted to watch a show about women in prison. And yet their user data told them something else. Now, they don't just stop at data-driven programming. what they do is also use visual data to try and think about how do we get you to actually watch this thing that we've created. So for every show that Netflix puts together, they essentially run a variation of different images. And what they're measuring is, what are the images that you're going to click into in order to actually watch a show? And how does that differ based on where you're from, your gender, your age range? And what you can start to see is over time, certain elements will emerge. In this case, the one with the green arrow is the one that won. But what you can start to see is patterns, patterns by age, patterns by gender, patterns that tell you that, hey, maybe every time it's a comedy, having two characters on the screen is always going to perform better than one. There is enough data now, because we essentially use imagery everywhere, to be able to unearth those kinds of patterns and really help you make creative decisions in a much more driven way. And if this still feels unbelievable or forlorn or something that you don't necessarily want to engage in, then I ask you one question, which is, do you believe that the way you look helps inform people's opinions of you? So at Google, we were taught to be very, very data-driven, and when I left to start my own company, one of the things I actually did, and again, I'm kind of anally data-driven, is I sat down after every meeting, I jotted down what I wore and things like that, and looked at how investor reaction and investor feedback changed as a result of the way I presented myself in the meeting. And by the fact that I'm wearing glasses, you could probably tell what the answer here was. But essentially, most of us already believe that the way we look influence people's perception of us. The question is, why wouldn't the same thing be the case for every single visual your brand shares on every single platform? All of these inform the perception we have. And so this is essentially what we do. We try to answer the why behind image performance and any creative performance. And the way we do it is by codifying images and then essentially finding patterns that look at what are the things that every single time when exposed to a user increase the cut-through rate and the engagement rate in real time. But all of this is quite abstract, and I think it's much easier to actually show you some of this in action by looking at some of the current imagery we're looking at for some of the public events happening. So a lot of the work we do for clients we can't actually talk about because the data we unearth for them is their competitive advantage. So in prep for this, we looked at some imagery around the US elections and New York Fashion Week. And what I'm curious about is whether or not you guys will get these right. So the first thing we looked at when we looked at Trump's imagery is, what does Trump best performing imagery have in common for 2016? So I'm going to ask you guys to raise your hands for whichever option you think is right. So who thinks Trump's best performing imagery had pictures of his family? Okay, handful. What about men in uniform? Okay. What about Hillary Clinton insults? Okay. So it seems like the bulk of the room said it was Hillary Clinton insults. And actually, it was men in uniform. Anytime Trump was seen next to someone in uniform, the engagement rate with his users went up. Now again, we're not saying that on Instagram or wherever it's better to use images of people in uniform. This is about what cuts through with his audience. The interesting thing here, or terrifying depending on how you look at it, is our system further isolated that within imagery of men in uniform and Trump, those images that had a gun further increased performance by another 6%, right? Terrifying. Now looking at Clinton's imagery. So which Clinton's been photographed with a lot of different people. Which Clinton sidekick, as it were, boosts engagement? So who thinks the best performance of Clinton is with Michelle Obama? Yeah. Okay, what about Bill? No. And Barack? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so this one's an easy one, Michelle, right? Everyone loves Michelle, Michelle wins. But who do you think is the worst performer here? Where do you think engagement is the lowest? Do you think, raise your hand if it was Bill. Raise your hand if it was Barack. Okay, yeah, you guys are right. It was Bill. And Bill and Hillary did okay, worse than the other two, but Bill on his own really tanks. They should stop running images of Bill, because no one wants to see that. The other really interesting thing here is we looked within the way Clinton and Trump were communicating. One of the things that we saw is there are kind of three main ways that they talk to their users visually speaking. One was charts, pretty obvious. One was facts. I use that in quotations. They're not checked facts. And another one was quotes. And for quotes, what's really fascinating here, and again, this is the first time a US election has, we've been able to look at the gender of the candidate really. But what you're seeing is something that's quite fascinating, where quotes perform really well for Hillary Clinton. They do a really good job at engaging her audience. But within quotes, quotes by other people do significantly better. So anytime they publish a quote about her said by someone else, they do better. For Trump, it's the exact opposite. Quotes don't do as well for him, but if he wants quotes to do well, he needs to take out all the quotes about him by other people and just put up quotes of things he's saying himself. That's what's really getting his audience going. So now switching to New York Fashion Week. So we rarely give insights on an industry or audience basis, mostly because we don't believe in that. We really believe it's about engaging with your audience. So the kinds of things that work for Virgin Atlantic are going to be very different than what works for British Airways because of the brand they've cultivated over the years. But that said, there's some really interesting data around Fashion Week that we unearthed. So which image style around Fashion Week do you think works best? Hands up if you think it's runway. Nope. Editorial? Nope. A few, okay, street style. Yes, okay, this was great, right? So this was a pretty easy one. So street style works really well. But what's interesting here is that the production cost of each of these is very different. And so street style works better. You guys guessed that. Most of the images that these guys were running around Fashion Week is runway. And it drops performance down and is significantly more costly to produce. So the question is why? Where is this folklore getting perpetuated where people are still doing this? And so, and this was something we saw across 20 different luxury fashion brands. And the last one I'll leave you with is, for luxury fashion, what type of model shot works best? Is it partial body, but the face visible? Who thinks it's that? Okay. What about partial body, but no face? Okay. What about a full body shot? Okay, so it doesn't seem like you guys know, because it's pretty even. And ultimately, what we have to admit here is what you guys are doing is guessing. Right, you guys are guessing, but the data's there. The data's in all your imagery, and it's there for you to actually know the answer. And here what we saw consistently was that essentially the best thing you could do for a luxury fashion company is cut the face off the model. Again, really interesting, right? We spend all this money hiring beautiful people, but essentially you probably just need a skinny girl, and you don't even need to worry about her face. So, so anyway, so this is, we're entering this age of data-driven creative decisions, and I think part of it is where the industry is taking us, part of it is where technology is taking us. Artificial intelligence, image recognition has never been more sophisticated than it is today. And ultimately what we're trying to do is get you to a point where next time you're in a big creative meeting and someone says, well, I just don't like it, you could say, well, I don't care because I have the data to show you that our users do. Thanks very much.